Alright everybody, welcome back to We Play Games. I'm Walker and here we are in Free Trade in Victoria 3. So I'm putting this free in parentheses because it's going to be one of those things that we're going to talk about at the end, but there are a lot of reasons to want to switch into Free Trade, and I think that generally speaking Free Trade is also misunderstood as a larger thing. So we'll talk about that individually, but most of this video is going to be dedicated to just a broad conversation about trade in Victoria 3. Trade is a complicated thing. There's a lot of stuff going on in terms of inputs and in terms of the political and economic effects of trade. And so I think a dedicated video to it makes sense. But before we dive in here, I want to make something clear. There are not just one input good when it comes to trade. It's not just, the good itself that you're trading. You need a lot of things in order to actually set up a trade route. You need bureaucracy, convoys, interests, trade partners, and then finally goods. And so in order to actually maximize and utilize trade, you really do want to be trying to juggle all 5 of those things and trying to develop them all individually. But before we dive in on those 5 things, let's talk about the effects of trade. So what is trade actually doing? So trade is taking one of the goods in one of the markets and selling it or buying it to the other market. So in this case, here's 7.5 units of liquor being imported from the Ottoman Empire. And what this is going to do is going to purchase some of these goods from the Ottoman Empire, 7.5 units of it, at the cost in the Ottoman market, and then sell it to us in the cost of our market. There's a little bit of back-end math in regards to the calculation between the two markets. It used to be that it was like hyper efficient and was causing serious problems, but they fixed that now. Now it mostly just reflects the real value between the markets. But the real value between the markets is what the trade route is trying to capture. This is the revenue. The revenue is coming from the productivity. The productivity is going to be the difference between the prices of the goods minus the tariffs times the unit of the good. Sometimes there's a cost in terms of convoys if you have to ship things overseas. If you're adjacent to the market in question, you can trade some volume of goods without paying any convoy cost. But of course, the knock-on effect of this is twofold. First, this good is no longer available in your market, so people aren't going to have access to it for standard of living purposes. And secondly, it is going to affect clout, because you're shifting some of the goods out of or into the market, which is going to increase or decrease the price of the good in question, and therefore increase or decrease the amount of money going to the ownership pops who own the land in question, or own the capital in question, which is a really roundabout way of saying if you're selling a bunch of agricultural goods, for instance, you're going to indirectly be giving money to the landowner. And so this is where the complication of politics and trade starts to emerge. Is it better to sell a good or buy a good if it makes a political enemy stronger? I'm telling you here in this video, yes, it doesn't matter if you're empowering the landowners by participating in a little bit of trade. That's a short-term problem because everything in Victoria 3 is interconnected, and creating that trade route doesn't just create that trade route which gives money to the landowner, it also creates critically a trade center building level. It creates a secondary building level for every level of the trade route. So that means it starts at 2 extra levels per trade route at level 1. It's 3 trade centers at a level 2, 4 trade centers at a level 3, so on and so forth. But what this means is you're not just creating money for landowners in this case, you're creating money for all of the pops working in these buildings. At the moment, that's going to be a lot of money going to shopkeepers and therefore making our petite bourgeoisie very powerful, very wealthy. They are in turn giving us a whole lot of bureaucracy, and they're giving us some interest reduction, which is going to be helpful because we had to switch into consumption taxes for political reasons. But the shopkeepers are generating some investment pool for us. So it's not like there's just money being created through these trade centers going nowhere. But at the moment, it's only 353 coming in through that trade center. And that's because of the nature of the pop owning this in question. Shopkeepers generally are pretty ineffective at doing investment pool reallocation. And so switching into free trade, privately owned, it increases capitalist employment, which means that you get way more money in terms of investment pool from your trade centers once you can get into free trade. And that means that the way you need to interact with trade from a meta perspective is actually completely different different if you're in free trade versus mercantilism. When you're in mercantilism, the costs on each individual trade route are going to be a lot higher in terms of your bureaucracy, but also the return in terms of your trade is going to be lower, right? You're just not getting very much in terms of investment pool right now. But once you get into free trade, which we're going to do right here, then we'll discuss how free trade is going to actually modify a lot of stuff for us. All right, so here we are. We've switched into free trade. So now we have plus 50% trade route volume, plus 50% trade route competitiveness, minus 50% trade route bureaucracy costs. And because of those three things together, a couple of things are about to happen. Now we have way, way, way lower bureaucracy costs for trade routes, which means that we can set up way more trade routes. But also critically, now our trade centers are going to be owned by capitalists. And so as our trade centers increase in value and productivity, we'll get way more money. So that's just like the brief meta introduction for trade. So now let's go through each of the input costs in turn and talk about them as a meta concept and ways to manipulate them. So first we have bureaucracy. Bureaucracy, of course, is the stuff that's going to be coming from your government administration buildings. But if you can get happy petite bourgeoisie, which you should be able to if you start relatively backwards, you'll have a lot of ownership methods going to the petite bourgeoisie. But even if you don't, and you just have shopkeepers in charge of big trade routes, you'll have non-marginalized petite bourgeoisie that are pretty happy with you most of the time. But the biggest way to modify your bureaucracy, first, of course, is to get into free trade. But secondly, is to probably prioritize getting paper into your government administration building. In this case, we have delayed standardized filing systems, which comes from central archives for just a little bit because we're trying to pick up egalitarianism here because, again, we got switched into consumption taxes by a movement. But once you can get into standardized filing systems, you can see here we get almost 200 more bureaucracy just out of the void for switching into standardized filing systems. It does mean a little more paper, but ultimately that's worth the cost. It also, of course, will increase your taxation capacity, which is generally more important as a larger nation than as a smaller one, but sometimes it gets you more money. You can also remove the bureaucracy costs through trade agreements, and so getting trade agreements with some very powerful nations can sometimes be really, really good for your economy. Like getting a trade agreement with Great Qing might be really good for us here. But generally speaking, trade agreements are a little dangerous. Trade agreements are going to encourage you to get more and more trade from one specific nation, and therefore your economy is sort of attached to theirs. So if we had a trade agreement with Great Qing, it would make it very easy for us to trade with each other, but fortunately we already have a treaty port, so we can trade with them kind of whenever we want to. But if we had a trade agreement, then Great Qing would probably trade more with us in turn. That would mean that the next time there's a civil war in Great Qing, we might suffer much more economic disruption. So having trade agreements are useful ways to manipulate your bureaucracy, but really they're more a diplomatic tool to try to get countries to like you enough to join your customs union than anything else. Because if you're trying to do just a lot of trade with someone, you're probably better off just adding them to your market long term. All right, up next we have convoys. So convoys you get generally from ports, but not exclusively from ports. You can get convoys from puppets, but you can also get synthetic convoys from treaty ports or just subjects adjacent to people. Because anytime you have a land border with someone, you get to use your land trade capacity in order to supplement your convoys required, which means that small trade routes over land are generally free in regards to their convoy cost. So getting land borders with people is immensely powerful in Victoria 3. You kind of want to get land borders with some of the most critical nations in the game, like Great Qing, but getting treaty ports is also helpful just in terms of developing your interests. But because most of your convoys are going to be coming from ports, you probably want to prioritize getting hydraulic cranes and, more importantly, gantry cranes online as early as possible, because these industrial ports get you really, really, really good return on convoys. But of course, the weight and nature of your expenditures in convoys are going to be limited. Ports are expensive, and they're also government buildings, and so you're responsible for paying the upkeep cost here. And so if you're trying to maximize your trade, rather than trying to maximize your ports, I would recommend just maximizing your land connections. So interests are the next input good. You can't trade with somebody unless you have an interest in a shared strategic region. But fortunately, you can get interests relatively easily if you just move around and take either subjects in relatively low infamy areas, because there's just not a lot of pops there, or if you take treaty ports. You can build interests locally by just owning land in those areas, and that'll give you more and more people you can trade with. You can also increase your interests by just building more navy. Every 10 ships you have will give you an extra floating interest, but they're kind of dangerous. They do rise and fall as your ships get destroyed in combat, and so make sure that if you're going to be using your navy in order to build your interests, that you're actually using your navy to build long-term interests as well. If you're building up a 30 stack here, which will probably expand to a 40 soon, then use it to naval invade people, take treaty ports. That said, navy generally is relatively inexpensive to get up and going. Once you've built up a lot of logging camps, shipyards should be pretty cheap, but do be aware that you do want long-term interests, not just boats. All right, so up next we have trade partners. So trade partners don't just have to be nations that you're friendly with. You can be trading with potential rivals. Do be aware that, of course, actual rivals will try to embargo you. If you're higher ranked than them, you can take a treaty port and then get around their embargo. But if you're both great powers and they embargo you, sorry, you can't trade with them. So that's why having some trade partners are actually pretty helpful. Trade partners, when you are at very, very high infamy, you're almost certainly going to have to take treaty ports even in smaller nations, because everyone will start embargoing you when you have like 150 infamy or whatever. But if you're playing it, relatively calm and not infamy chasing, you can get a lot of value out of trading with people, because trade is going to influence diplomacy, right? Here, Prussia is not willing yet to enter into a trade agreement with us, but we're at plus 28 right now from the volume of trade routes between our markets. And so by being in free trade and therefore able to support more trade across the board, you can create more diplomatic friendships. And that's a great way to expand your interests too. If you can just trade with somebody until they're willing to join your customs union, then you didn't even have to spend the money to naval invade them. So trade partners are pretty good, but I think that they are kind of limited by the way you can interact with them. Some trade partners only have one or two goods that you want to buy from them. Some trade partners just don't have enough money to buy anything from you. So I would encourage you from a long-term perspective not to think of trade partners as being something you maintain long-term, but something that begins a relationship between your states, something that opens the door for future political negotiations. So here, for instance, we're taking a treaty port in Mexico, but we might come back and turn them into a dominion later, because I think it might be helpful to stop the growth of the United States. But having a treaty port in their territory means any future invasion doesn't necessarily have to be by ship. We can launch a land-based invasion of Mexico. All right, so let's talk about the fifth and final input good here, the good itself. So the good itself does, of course, have an impact socially on your nation, right? Having cheaper grain inside your market means that poor people are going to have easier access buying it. When they have easier access buying it, your standard of living will go up. You can see here, basically, whenever we switched into corn laws, we immediately just started buying grain from Great Qing, and our standard of living flourished. This means that any good that you trade is going to have an impact on your society, right? If you're trading for iron and you're buying it and you're bringing it in, you're making industry cheaper to run inside your country, but you're also making it harder for your investment pool to identify developing iron as being profitable, because there's a lower price on iron. So what that means, of course, is that your investment pool is going to go out in search of a different good to develop, which means that by trading in one good or another, by buying it or selling it and manipulating the price inside your market, you're going to manipulate the behavior of the private market of your country. And that manipulated behavior, in turn, will create capital for some of these interest groups here, and it might change the politics of your nation in a way you don't want, right? If you make it very profitable for people to grow silk because you export a whole bunch of silk to somebody, then you're going to tell the market broadly, hey, go ahead and develop silk. The state is going to support your financial expedition by exporting it, thereby providing demand and providing money to the existing owners of these silk plantations. I'm telling you here, that's not that big a deal. The actual good that you trade is not that important, except when your nation is very small. When your nation is very small, the goods that you want to be trading are very important. You want to make sure that you're setting up yourself to succeed on construction goods, so make sure that you can pay for wood, fabric, and iron, and then everything else is not important. It's easy to make money exporting stuff like luxury clothes, simply because there's a lot of built-up demand for luxury clothes in a lot of the world. There are many markets that don't have any luxury clothes production, but they have aristocrats who want to buy them. So you can make a ton of money just showing up and selling luxury clothes. Similarly, there are just a bunch of nations that start with excess production on sugar, and so you can make tons of money by just importing a whole bunch of sugar once you're in free trade. But don't think about it as a social manipulation construct just based off of the good. Now that said, because of the way tariffs work, there is a slight bonus to trading in expensive goods versus in cheap goods, especially if you're trying to get around tariffs, because tariffs are applied based off of the base market price of the good, not the actual market price of the good. But here's the real value of free trade. By getting free trade on the books here, we're going to be able to go through and just find tons and tons of new import routes that we can set up. So one final note I want to give to you is a note on free trade itself. So when you're not in free trade, when the bureaucracy cost of each trade route is actually really high, 15 is a pretty enormous premium that you have to pay. And so you're not just going to spam trade routes. So that means that when you're not in free trade, you have a very strong control over the size of your trade center. It's oftentimes going to be able to grow up to its cash reserve limit without any sort of issue. But when you switch over to free trade and you unlock just enormous amounts of bureaucracy and you set up a lot of different trade routes, those trade routes in turn will increase the size of the trade center, but that means that the cash reserve cap is actually increased in turn. And so when you're in free trade and you have this enormous trade center employing tons and tons of capitalists who you want to get dividend taxes and investment pool from, you really want to make sure that your cash reserves are building up to their cap as quickly as possible. You can do that by limiting the number of very small trade routes that you set up, but given how powerful trade routes are in terms of generating money for your economy, you kind of want to just get as many trade routes as you can, but then you want to go and make sure that as many of those trade routes are green as possible. So that way your weekly balance will be as positive as possible. You'll build up to your cash reserve cap as quickly as possible. If you have the money to subsidize your trade centers, I actually recommend doing it while they're building up to their cash reserves. When you switch into free trade, once they're at their cash reserve cap, you can usually turn the subsidies off because you're mostly going to be trading in goods that are going to make you money anyway. But it can take a long time to build up to the cash reserve cap just because of how many trade routes you're going to be able to feed in when you're in free trade. You can see here that we're up to 5.77k investment pool coming in from just trade centers at the moment. And as we build our economy and grow our empire, that'll increase more and more. And I also want to note that the social engineering side of trade is largely overstated. Most of the social engineering that you're going to do in game is going to be through construction. There will be a little bit in regards to the massive new employment of capitalists under free trade and the gigantic amount of money that all of those trade centers are going to generate are going to give the industrialists quite a lot of clout. And it is going to hurt the petite bourgeoisie when you switch out of free trade because they're losing ownership of the trade center buildings. But in terms of what social engineering you get out of the trade goods, it really is extremely minimal, and I wouldn't overstate it. Just trade for productivity. That's generally good when you're even in mercantilism, but when you're in mercantilism, you're also trying generally to balance out your imports. Like right now, we don't have any lead, and so all of the lead that we have, we're forced to buy from people. That's something that you'll do earlier on, but once you have free trade and infinite money, then you can just start conquering your lead. All right, that's Walker, and that's Trade here on We Play Games. Take care.